Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Biannual Research Colloquium. This is session 2 of day 3, and our focus for today, the theme is on finding solutions to some of the social challenges that exist in the world. And this is a continuation of the theme on human trafficking. And so we have Dr. Jarrod Sadulski here, and he'll be able to sort of share his expertise, and not only on what he's learned just through life and through training, but also in particular what he's learned from his research working with the Colombian, Interpol and those kinds of policing organizations that help target human trafficking. So Jarrod, I'll just turn it over to you and let you get started.
Okay, thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad that you're here. I hope that the presentation is informative. To discuss with you what we plan on reviewing today. Here's the overview slide. So we'll talk a little bit about human trafficking, what I found in Colombia. We'll talk about Interpol and the work that the Interpol does in terms of combating human trafficking, as well as some of the strategies that the Colombian government employs that I'm an advocate for other countries in the region in Latin America using as well, because they're effective. Colombia is a tier 1 country in terms of human trafficking, and it also, as we'll discuss today, takes a lot of strides, much more so than many other countries in the region, to try to combat human trafficking. So we'll discuss all that. We'll discuss the strategies that they're using to disrupt human trafficking and how that differs from what we're seeing in other places, including the United States. Obviously, we'll discuss the size of the human trafficking problem globally, and then we'll discuss the importance of recognizing and mitigating human trafficking. So to tell you a little bit about me, so I've got 22 years of experience in Homeland Security. The vast majority of that has been in counter trafficking, counter human trafficking, counter narcotics trafficking, and counter human smuggling. I've worked with various different governments. I've worked in different locations around the country, as well as I've worked in operations, primarily in Miami, working with some of the authorities from the World Bahamian Defense Force, along with some of our law enforcement agencies to combat human trafficking, drug trafficking coming into the United States through that Southeast Florida corridor. And so I've done that for 22 years, and I've developed an interest in human trafficking because of what I've seen. I've interdicted, the smugglers bringing trafficking victims into the United States. I've talked to them, I've heard their stories. And then as I transitioned further and further away from law enforcement, more into education, I still had a strong interest in what's really going on with human trafficking. One of the first questions I had is why? Why is human trafficking so becoming such a prolific problem? And the answer is simple. And if you look at it from a criminal perspective, if I'm going to sell you a kilo of cocaine, okay, I need to go out and I need to purchase or steal that kilo of cocaine. Then I sell it to you. Once I sell it to you, I no longer have a product to sell. I need to go back and acquire another kilo of cocaine to make a second sale to you. Well, human trafficking, what are gangs throughout the United States, throughout Latin America, organized crime groups, what they've all realized is that instead of having one product to sell and then needing to go back and get a second product to sell, if they exploit a human trafficking victim, say for example a sex trafficking victim, they can sell that product. They can sell that person. Research tells us 20 to 30 times a day is what some of the sex trafficking victims are enduring. So just imagine that instead of making one sale of a kilo of cocaine and needing to get another kilo, traffickers can sell a person over and over and over again, all in the same day, without the cost of needing to go get additional product or supply. So in blunt terms, that's why organized crime, gangs, and criminals have now focused on human trafficking. It's very, very profitable. As we know, it's $150 billion industry worldwide, and that's part of why. So what's happening, what we're seeing is organizations both domestically as well as international, are developing networks to where once a victim is um, into the human trafficking realm, they're stuck. And what ultimately happens is, they end up getting moved from one location to another location throughout the human trafficking or sex trafficking network. And I really found that to be true here in the United States. So I've looked at that. I've also looked at what's going on with the migrants that are moving throughout Central America toward the United States and the impact of human trafficking that exists there. So briefly on human trafficking, I'm sure we're all aware there's three components of human trafficking: sex trafficking, labor trafficking, and domestic servitude. Perfect example that actually it's a true story that comes from Colombia of labor trafficking is there was an individual, his name was Manuel. He was 22 years old, had a new wife, and they had a baby they were expecting. Manuel, which Colombia is a very impoverished country, was a hard worker, but certainly didn't have the money to afford a new child coming in. They lived in the slums of Medellin. And ultimately, somebody approached him and said that if he comes to the United States, he will be able to make money that he's able to send back to Colombia to support his family, and ultimately will build up so much money that he's going to be able to bring his wife and soon-to-be child to the United States. So he agrees, and they leave Colombia, and they go through the Central American route, and they go through the southwest border, and he immediately knows that things aren't normal. He knows that he's being smuggled into the United States, but what he didn't realize was the harshness of the traffickers themselves. They brandished weapons. They threatened to use the weapons. They were very harsh and very difficult in working with Manuel all the way through his transit time. Ultimately, they took him to New York City. In New York City, he stayed in an apartment. I believe it was a two-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn. It had many, many people that were living in the apartment. And what would happen is they were basically being taken and exploited for work somewhere in the city. And while he was gone, his group was gone, there was another group that would be allowed to rest in the house. As soon as his workday, his 12, 14, 16-hour workday was over, he would come to the house. And in order for there to be enough floor space for people to sleep, the people that were currently there would then go to work. And this went on for a while. He abused, he was abused physically. Inside the house, the traffickers would forcibly rape females. He was forced to watch that, and he ultimately didn't get paid. Anything that he had of any value was taken away from him at the beginning of the trip. He wasn't getting paid at all, and if anything, it was basically in food rations. Knowing that it's the likely outcome of this is going to be death, he decided when he was in the back of the van on the way to work, he saw a New York City police car. He opened up the back door of the van. He jumped out at 30, 40 mile an hour, ran to the police officer, told the police officer what was going on. The van obviously sped away. And because he was blindfolded around the apartment, he was unable to tell police where the apartment was. ICE got involved, did an investigation, attempted to locate and rescue the others, and they ultimately never were able to. So this is a story that originated from Colombia that is in fact a true story, and it shows how labor trafficking works specifically out of Latin America. Domestic servitude, is a person that is hired to be a maid at a house. Their passport's kept, they're not paid adequately, and they're not free to leave. So that also exists. And then of course, sex trafficking, which we'll talk quite a bit about today. So what interested me about Colombia was a couple of years prior, I started going to Belize. I went to Belize because it's an English-speaking nation. If you're not familiar with Belize, it is in the middle of Central America, bordered by Honduras to the south, Guatemala to the west, and Mexico to the north. Belize is a really interesting place. A substantial portion of the Colombian cocaine goes through Belize, as well as a substantial portion of human trafficking victims, sex trafficking victims, go through Belize. Belize is difficult because it has a border dispute with neighboring Guatemala, and nobody can agree where the border lines are. So what happens is the cartels purchase all this land on the Belize-Guatemala border, and nobody knows whose jurisdiction that is. So ultimately, the cartels operate with immunity on this land because neither government can agree on whose land it is and who has jurisdiction. So the traffickers are using this to obviously move cocaine and drugs, they're also using it to move a lot of people. And so I learned all this when I was in Belize, but just fingers kept continuing to be pointed to Colombia when I was there. And so it started to build my interest in seeing what was really going on in Colombia. And so, but that it went from there. I was working, doing some consulting work with the government in Belize, doing a lot of consulting work actually. And the more I went down there, the more that I went down there for work, I would also spend time going to the asylum villages, which weren't Colombian. The asylum villages were primarily from El Salvador, but I would get to talk to the victims, about why they were leaving El Salvador, running from human trafficking, running from, the violent gangs in MS-13. So this is what built my interest into Latin American affairs. And so with that, I decided to reach out to an individual that was on a whim. Actually, I contacted him through LinkedIn. I contacted him because I saw that he was a high-ranking official of the National Police of Colombia. And I also saw on his LinkedIn profile that he went to Boston University. And I knew that if he went there, he must speak English. And two, I also saw that he graduated from the FBI National Academy. The FBI National Academy is it's a prestigious school that police officers from around the world, like the best of the best, get sent there to train. And the fact that he was an FBI NA, National Academy graduate, said a lot. So I decided to reach out, and I told him that I've been working in Central America. I'm really interested in seeing South America. And that ultimately was what led to the trip. As he said, "Come on down, we will lay out the red carpet for you." And it was a little uneasy because if you read the State Department's warnings about Colombia, they make you think that you're walking into a violent war zone, when in fact it was very much like New York City. And so in February of 2020, I went down to Bogota, Colombia, and I met with an individual that I'd never spoken to in person. We communicated back and forth via email to set up the trip, but he told me that if I come down, put a little trust in him, that he will show me through everything I want to see in terms of narcotics trafficking and human trafficking in Colombia. And that's exactly how the trip got started. It turns out he is the head of INTERPOL in Colombia. I didn't know that until I was there. Well, if you're not familiar with INTERPOL, it's the International Criminal Police Organization. They have 194 member countries throughout the world. And ultimately, the role of INTERPOL is to share intelligence communication among the different countries about transnational crime, which will certainly fall into the purview of human trafficking. And so INTERPOL, we have it here in the United States, like I said, 194 countries. They're very, very good at what they do. There's a lot of analysts that work at INTERPOL. They'll basically put together the piece of a puzzle in terms of transnational crime. One country has this problem, another country maybe has the money laundering problem. This country may have the trafficking problem. And ultimately, it's INTERPOL that communicates, brings these countries together. They share intelligence and they conduct operations together. And when something's going on, say, for example, somebody has a warrant for murder in the United States and it's hiding in Peru, it would be the United States and Peruvian INTERPOL that would communicate that. It would be the INTERPOL organization in conjunction with law enforcement in Peru that would go out and apprehend this individual. So that's the background of INTERPOL. They operate what's called national central bureaus, and that basically is where their investigators, their intelligence analysts, all of them work. So I got to see INTERPOL when I was in Bogota, and I was provided a presentation by the head of INTERPOL, and she provided some fantastic information. She actually provided me some charts and maps that I have in this presentation we'll go over today. But that was part of the trip. I also got to go to the General Prosecution Office of the nation. I sat down for an hour with what would be their version of the head of the DEA in Colombia. And I also went to the Anti-Narcotics Directorate, which was fascinating. It's at the airport at El Dorado Airport in Bogota, and all of the assets that the world's largest producer of cocaine is all in this many-acre facility, from helicopters to planes to spy planes to maps. You go into a room and it has all the information laid out, and what the current issues are and the current routes are in drug trafficking. And I found the whole trip to be just amazing. And if I wouldn't have taken a little risk in going down there, and I didn't go alone, I did take a colleague, but if I wouldn't have done that, taken this risk, I wouldn't have learned, what came out of the trip. But before we move on, one thing I want to mention, my biography, and I've been telling everybody this, so I don't want to miss the opportunity to mention it to you. So one thing a project that I've been working on since October, and I'm very, very passionate about, and we are now at the ninth inning, is I do some podcasts. And I did a podcast with the state attorney's office, the Human Trafficking Director, our coordinator, and I'd asked why is it that we are so behind the eight ball in prosecuting human trafficking cases? Why is it that human traffickers operate almost with impunity? You very rarely hear about human trafficking arrest, and then you even more rarely hear about a conviction. And I asked why. And what she explained was that in the state of Florida, that we're one of only 12 states that allows defense depositions of underage victims of sex trafficking. She said that the coercion and the tone of questioning and the psychological trauma that is occurring to the survivor of the child survivor of sex trafficking is so traumatic and so terrible for the child that they are unable or unwilling to testify in open court. Therefore, it's forcing the state attorney's office to either drop or mitigate the charge. And she said that's happening in the vast majority, if not nearly all, of the human trafficking cases that involves minor children. So I picked up on that. I spoke with a child psychologist that works specifically with sex trafficking victims in Florida, and she echoed the same concern. So I've been working since October. I'm currently SB 1178. If anybody's interested in it, it's the legislation that I work with some attorneys to craft, and is right now currently in the Florida House, and is going to be voted on very, very soon. That ultimately will provide much needed safeguards for child victims of sex trafficking in the state of Florida. It basically doesn't completely prohibit defense depositions, but what it does is it requires the judge to provide a protection order in every case of sex trafficking that involves a child. And the statute outlines exactly what we're looking for in that protection order in terms of questions that may be asked, the tone that may be used. The child has the choice to answer the questions in writing or verbally. And I'm confident this legislation will get passed, and I'm confident that that it's something that for the foreseeable future, it's going to help increase human trafficking, sex trafficking cases, criminal cases, at least in the state of Florida. So I forgot to mention that in my bio. That's something that's near and dear to me that I've been working on for a long time, and I'm looking forward to getting that done. So wanted to make sure that I shared that with you. As we talked about with Interpol, one thing that I didn't mention is the criminal databases. They are very effective at, if somebody's under suspicion of human trafficking in one country, all the countries know about it. It's ultimately the best way that I would word that. So working with Interpol and going down there to Colombia, I was able to hear about the government strategy. So in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, TVPA, Colombia is a tier 1 country. So basically that means that they are taking steps that are effective toward mitigating sex trafficking or human trafficking. And so, and I tell you, I saw it firsthand. They've launched an anti-trafficking information system in 2019 that ultimately, we'll discuss the geography of Colombia that'll kind of explain why the human trafficking and drug trafficking is so difficult to mitigate there. But this new anti-trafficking information system basically, it's been around for 2 years. It shares information from different police bureaus around the country with Interpol to collect intelligence that ultimately is used to track trafficking victims. They also use special prosecutors. They train special prosecutors that deal only with human trafficking cases in the country. And that's something that they found to be very effective. And that's something that I have not seen a lot of other countries do. And so the use of special prosecutors is very effective in Colombia. They also have special training, or they have special detectives that only focus on human trafficking cases. And again, this is something that's led them to be a tier 1 country because it's working. And so for the TVPA, Trafficking Victims Protection Act, they've done well at maintaining a tier 1. So to tell you a little bit about the history of Colombia, we've all heard of Colombia, but if you haven't been there, it's kind of hard to visualize. So Colombia has been in an internal armed conflict for over 50 years. And a lot of this, there's a lot of anti-government insurgents, there's a lot of terrorism that exists in Colombia, and there's a lot of civil unrest. And one of the things that has always been, not always, but for many, many decades, has been a problem are these revolutionary groups that are fueled by drug profits and human trafficking profits. The FARC, Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, there was actually an agreement, an accord that was made in Havana, Cuba in 2015 that they would dissolve. And they were, for a long time, for decades, the largest and most dangerous armed force insurgent, I should say armed force, insurgent group in Colombia. You know, they ran a lot of the jungles and the areas of Colombia that that are difficult for law enforcement to get to. They were under the complete control of the FARC. And they have disbanded. However, many of them have not gotten out of the business. They've just left that organization. They've started their own organization. And where Colombia used to be a country of organized crime, it was a hierarchy. You would have somebody, you know, leading the organization, and then you would have, you know, different ranks and levels throughout the criminal organizations. Today, it doesn't exist. Today, there's over 2,000 drug trafficking organizations in Colombia. They're all decentralized. They don't use a hierarchy system. In other words, you know, if you went and made an arrest of a major trafficker back 20 years ago, it would have a ripple effect throughout the organization. Today, the trafficking organizations work together, but have very little communication. And that's why it's so difficult for law enforcement, both on the drug trafficking as well as the human trafficking side, to stop this, is because there's 2,000 organizations engaged in drug trafficking that I can tell you there is a very close nexus to drug trafficking and human trafficking. Again, we'll go back to my sell of a kilo of cocaine to you. If I sell that kilo of cocaine, I need to go out and get more. A trafficking victim, obviously, it doesn't work that way. So that's why you see such a close nexus between the human trafficking and the drug trafficking realm. The ELN is the current revolutionary insurgent group that is wreaking havoc in Colombia. When I was there, the police had informed me that the ELN had made a threat, which apparently they commonly do, and they translated it to me. It was a YouTube video, and it basically said that for a 72-hour period while I was there, I was actually started the last day I was there. And it was a 72-hour period that they said that anyone that is outside of their hotel, home, residence during these 72 hours, that unless they are, and they gave a list of who was permitted to be traveling, that they would be shot on site. And the police were taking it very seriously, as you would see, you know, just overnight, 3 times as many police officers on the streets. And I was in Bogota, which is the capital. The issue is there are areas of Colombia that don't get adequate police protection because they're very remote. They're operated by villages, and there's a lot of tribal land that's especially in Northeast Colombia. And so those areas are under the control of the ELN. And whenever they make these lockdowns, those are the folks that are really in the most danger. It's not really those in the city. And obviously I was in the city, and we drove from the hotel to the airport during that lockdown and didn't have any problem. But I did read in the news after I came home, because it started a 3-day period. It started the last day I was there, so that's why now. But I did read in the news that, you know, there were a lot of people murdered, including police officers, during that 72-hour lockdown. So it just goes to show, you know, the violence that exists, and it's a shame. You know, the Colombian government, the National Police of Colombia, is one of the best police departments, and I've studied police departments from around the world. You know, I would hold them up there with NYPD. You know, they are. They have they utilize a lot of technology. You know, they utilize a lot of training. Their structure is very well operated, or it was very well put together. And the problem is that Colombia, you know, there are regions that they just can't get to. There are many regions in Colombia that don't have roads. The only way to get there is by helicopter, and then even then, you know, it's often in thick dense jungles that there's no place to land. So there is no law enforcement in those areas. There's perhaps the military does patrol those areas, but it's it's very remote. And if you live in those areas of Colombia, which would be outside of major cities, these insurgent groups really are the enforcement. They really are the law in those areas. So part of what's going on in Colombia, or victims in Colombia. So the internal conflict that I speak of has resulted in the loss of almost 9 million lives. Or, I'm sorry, let me reword that, has impacted 9 million victims, not lives. So the internal conflict has impacted almost 9 million victims, many of which have been maimed because of bombings. They've there's people that have obviously lost limbs, and certainly many people that have lost lives. So due to the internal conflicts, there have been 353,000 acts of violence that the Colombian Historical Memory National Center documented. There have been, during this conflict, there's been 262 million Colombians that have died, and 80,000 have disappeared. 37,000 kidnappings. The police department has its own special department that just handles kidnappings. 180,000 murders, and more related to human trafficking, sex trafficking would be the 15,000 victims of sexual violence. So, if you ask me why do these problems exist in Colombia, it is one word, and it is so simple, and it's one thing that was echoed throughout the government meetings that I attended. It's cocaine. Cocaine is an evil that has crippled what I think is probably the most beautiful country in the world, certainly the most beautiful country I've seen. It's incredible down there. And the Colombian people were fantastic. They couldn't have been any more welcoming. But that's the answer. That's the reason why, is because of the cocaine trade has crippled that country, and greed has gone all the way through the government. There have been former presidents that have been suspected of being in association with the drug traffickers. There's certainly high-level politicians that are getting indicted on a frequent basis in Colombia because of the coercion that has come with cocaine. So some other things that were mentioned is there's a dispute for land, and that a lot of farmers don't own the land that they farm on. There's obviously a lot of political unrest. While I was there was a riot in the street, and it was just so you know how this trip went. So basically, we had a police detective that picked my colleague and I up in the morning. We would go to meetings throughout the day and drop us off at the hotel at night. So we always had an armed escort. But at one point, I heard a gunshot, and so I leaned down in the vehicle and was trying to figure out what's going on. And when I looked ahead, I saw a couple hundred people blocking the street, and law enforcement in riot gear, basically moving them out of the street to clear the streets. And they explained that that's a daily occurrence in Bogota and some of the other major cities around the universities. It's actually the universities that is where the most of the civil unrest comes from. And I learned that while I was down there. So those are some of the contributing factors. Corruption, corruption as it relates to cocaine has crippled this country. And here's a chart that they had provided that shows ultimately the cycle of crime and poverty that exists in Colombia. So different forms of different forms of human trafficking in Colombia. They separate and investigate differently transnational and domestic human trafficking in Colombia. Obviously, transnational is where they're being sent to a different country, and we're going to talk about where the vast majority of trafficking victims end up whenever they're trafficked out of Colombia. We'll talk about that in a little bit. There's also a lot of internal trafficking that exists. So our modalities of human trafficking in Colombia: the sexual exploitation, labor exploitation. That's common in the United States as well. But in Colombia, they also deal with organ trafficking, marriage for asylum, and homeless exploitation. And that is also categorized as human trafficking in Colombia, which is different from the United States. So Victimization, you know, kidnappings do occur, although similar to the United States. Everybody thinks of, when we think of human trafficking as the scary utility van pulling up to our child and scooping our child up into a utility van and driving quickly down the street. And yes, that does occur on occasion, but far, far more likely is going to be coercion and deception, both in Colombia and the United States. And it's really very similar in both ways, in both places. Somebody will gain the trust of a potential victim. They usually find them online, social media. Social media platforms are a breeding ground for human trafficking. It's something that, there's the traffickers specifically look for vulnerabilities in children on social media, a child that complains about their family in an open chat room, or to their friend list that the traffickers been able to infiltrate, either because the settings weren't set properly or because they were able to gain the trust of the child with false pretenses. This is how human trafficking occurs on a daily basis. And it's through that coercion and deception. In Colombia, more so than here, a lot of victims are located through modeling agencies, or we heard this, they are promised a modeling job. So they leave home, they leave their town that they're from to go to perhaps a big city, only to find out there is no modeling job waiting for them. And then therefore they're told that they have to engage in sex for hire. And if they work off their debt to the trafficker, then they can go home. But ultimately, very rarely are they able to escape that cycle. Our trafficking profiles of traffickers in Colombia very similar to here. They maintain passports, they maintain the victim's money, trip documentation, they control the expenditures, they control if the victim goes and seeks medical care, they often accompany the victim, and they control what the victim's permitted to say, who the victim's permitted to speak to. So the trafficking profiles really are very similar to the United States. So our victim profiles, typically low-income women that are head of the household are especially susceptible because they need money. Again, there's very little resources for the impoverished in Colombia, and that's used as a vulnerability. Obviously, homelessness. It's been my experience in the couple hundred victims that I've either interdicted or interacted with. There's almost always a nexus to there's always a nexus of power and control over them. And there's also often a nexus to drugs. Drugs are used by the traffickers to keep the victim numb from the physiological, the psychological pain that they're enduring. So in Colombia, our victim profiles often exploited through false job offers, as I mentioned before about modeling, but also as nannies, waitresses, and salespeople. And of course, recruitment through social media is huge around the world. And also, victims can be forced into the sex trade through marriage. So they basically get married to be provided a better life, and ultimately be led and forced into sex trafficking. So one thing that I found the most interesting, is you would think that the victims of human trafficking in Colombia, the United States would be a destination country. It's not. The number one destination for trafficked victims out of Colombia is Asia. And that by a far margin, I believe it was like 80% of transnational human trafficking out of Colombia goes to Asia. Very, very little to the United States. And if they do come to the United States, they come to the United States for labor trafficking instead of sex trafficking. Interesting, because that's completely different than a lot of other Latin American countries, specifically in Central America. The United States is the primary market. In Colombia, it's not. In Colombia, the primary market, as I mentioned, is Asia, and then Europe behind Asia. And that's reflected on this chart, which is a little small. I hope you can see it. As I mentioned, vast majority of trafficking victims sent to Asia. Mexico and the United States can be a destination, but as I mentioned, most cases involve labor trafficking. If a victim in Colombia comes to the United States, it's often for labor. So some of the laws they've enacted, they've added human trafficking. So some of the United States put a law in place in 2000, which was the first, their first human trafficking law. And also they've updated those laws 2002, 2003, 2005. One of the things they've done that is different than other Latin American countries that I've spoken to is they go into these bilateral agreements with different countries to share intelligence, to share information, to work collaboratively to mitigate human trafficking, which is an effective approach. While I was there, they've given me the list of different countries that they work with and told me about some of the cases and operations that they've done with these other countries. In addition to what I discussed earlier, they have prison sentences that the range for trafficker typically 13 to 23 years. That may not sound like much until you consider what a Colombian prison really looks like. And I've done a lot of prison work, a lot of prison studying of prisons. I've visited prisons. I do a lot of humanitarian work at the Belize Central Prison. Matter of fact, try to go down at least once a year. I haven't because of COVID, but prior to that, I was going down once a year to go down and do humanitarian work in the form of providing training to the 250 staff members of the Belize prison. And I've seen the difference in the quality of prisons, and I've looked at Colombian prisons, and it's horrifying. I can tell you stories. It's there's very little budget in Colombia for the prisons, so it shows. It makes a difference. So one of the things that I found interesting is that there are different areas of Colombia. It's a map of Colombia. As you can see, that the areas to the east in the south are primarily jungle, but Antioquia is where Medellin is, and these areas, these 5 areas that are listed on here, are your areas of larger cities. They have larger cities in them, and victims are taken out of the remote areas outside of the city, but then are brought into the city to be trafficked. So basically where we're at with this, in my opinion, is in order to combat and mitigate human trafficking, there has to be public awareness. There has to be public awareness in Colombia, there has to be public awareness in the United States. People need to be aware of what it is, what it looks like, when it's going on in my neighbor's house, what it looks like. When I see it as a police officer and I pull over a car and there's 4 underage girls in there with a 40-year-old male that's not their dad, these are things that need to be on the forefront of not just first responders and medical personnel's minds, but they also need to be on the minds of, there needs to be awareness within the general public, because there have been cases of somebody seeing something that just doesn't look right and then asking the person, are you okay? And the person saying no. And ultimately the citizen being proactive, calling the police, calling whoever, the authorities that they call, and ultimately save the child. There have been cases like this, but there could be far, far more. So in order to mitigate human trafficking, I think there really has to be awareness at the public level, as well as local law enforcement. And that's what I'm working with now. My next trip to Colombia is to perhaps provide training, which would be through curriculum. It wouldn't be a presentation, but to provide curriculum on how their police officers can recognize human trafficking, or the general patrol officers. That's something I've been working on a lot in the United States as well as Central America, is helping specifically immigration personnel in Belize, as well as police officers in the United States, recognize, okay, well, something's not right. What's the next step? What do I need to do to take it a step further? Once we have more people on board doing that, is when we'll be able to at least mitigate the problem of human trafficking. We talked about INTERPOL. They're focusing on, as I mentioned, public education, specialized training, interagency coordination, things that we've discussed. So talking about the National Police of Colombia, there's 160,000 police officers, which sounds like a lot. The problem is there's 40 million citizens in Colombia. So when you think about that ratio, and you think that the police are unable to access certain parts of the country, you can see why human trafficking as well as drug trafficking are such a major problem. So Fiscalia is the same thing as their Attorney General's office, and they have 35 representatives within that office that focus solely on human trafficking. And I was able to sit down with their department head and discuss specific cases, specific strategies that they're using. The National Police also has 75 investigators that focus solely on human trafficking investigations. So, if you take a look at this, this chart kind of displays the global implications of human trafficking. You can see in the United States, our biggest problems, sexual exploitation. It's really that way throughout the Americas, where forced labor is more of a problem in the African continent, in areas, in the Middle East, and in Europe. Speaking of the United States, this is a map of human trafficking in the United States, and this is from the Polaris Project. It was a couple of years ago, but as you can see, there are areas, and I live in Florida, and I believe we're the third or fourth highest in human trafficking cases in the U.S., but every state has been impacted by human trafficking. And this is just what we know. And if you consider 80% of human trafficking cases are never identified, victims are never identified, often because they don't realize they're a victim, this number is much, much higher. So for anybody who is interested in learning more, I'd recommend the Trafficking of Persons report, 20th edition that came out in June. This is what we've reviewed. This is my contact information. That's my email. That's my website. Please feel free to reach out at any time. I think we have 15 minutes left for questions. What questions can I answer?
That's a big question in and of itself there, Jarrod. What questions can you answer?
Not too many.
Very fascinating research about the human trafficking scenario and sort of details in Colombia in terms of their travel paths, in terms of the exploitation methods, their destinations and the types of exploitation. So very interesting. As I was listening to your session, I was drawing connections to our previous session this morning, and y'all said a lot of similar overlap about causes and outcomes of this and some of the similar legislation. So does anyone have questions for Dr. Sadulski before I sort of start hitting him with some questions? Let me look in the chat. They may have put their questions in the chat even. Yeah, Dr. Beeman says it is sad that this is a worldwide issue. And then Dr. Erkfitz said, hey, great job. And what a trip you took. I will, while people sometimes are putting their thoughts together, share my ideas that I took from my notes. And it was a little James Bondish there, Jarrod, when you said I just met some guy on the internet, and I think you said it was she who was the head of INTERPOL, maybe, and you just showed up, and that was the first time you saw me. My first word would be, are these people going to kidnap me and start harboring my organs and labor exploiting me and etc. But anyway, I thought an interesting verb in the very beginning of your presentation where you use the verb disrupt human trafficking, and disrupt really implies you can not really stop it, right? You just want to mess with it, and now it's going to adjust in some way to overcome the way you messed with it and create now a new path. You were saying things like, well, in these unclaimed areas between border countries like Guatemala and Colombia, they or other areas, maybe it was Belize and so forth, but no one's claimed that from a country. So these exploiters, these traffickers, buy it, and now that's just a free pathway, right all the way through. So it was interesting that you used the verb disrupt, which kind of implies that this is a very difficult issue to challenge. And I was really thinking about that. Has it somewhat in these societies, because it's gone on for maybe decades and even generations, it has just become part of society. It is just something that is tolerated. It is something that we've been desensitized to, almost like homelessness sometimes, that we don't even notice it anymore. Or it is sometimes the only option, and so that was my concern as I was listening, is are part of the solutions developing the economy of these countries so that folks have legitimate ways to make money and good money enough to live and take care of their families, that they don't have to resort to these, types of living circumstances to make money. And it's sad not only for the victims, but it's just as sad for the perpetrators, in my opinion, because who in the world wants to exploit another human being? Who would choose that? You would only choose that if you have no other choices. If you can't make money any other way, and this is the only way you could survive, we would sell drugs ourselves. If your baby needed food and you couldn't get a job, we would steal, we would do that. So I always think if we lift up the economy of some of the countries that may be heavily immigrating to us because they're just coming for jobs, but if they don't have to come because they have jobs, and I don't have to sell drugs because I have a job. I don't have to go and exploit others because I have a job. I don't have to do some of these criminal activities because I have jobs. Seems like I know it's just as monstrous of a challenge, but at the same time, if I can buy land in order to create human and drug trafficking highways, why can't I buy land and build factories? Right. And employ people and put them to work? So those are some of my learnings. I did also think you mentioned a national anti-trafficking information system. And over several of our presentations this week, having a centralized information system for people to be able to track and monitor and communicate and be able to just have everything in one location has been a theme. And I think it's interesting that in some ways we have to make sure that we are monitoring this stuff in a more centralized location so we can identify those patterns that exist. Does anyone else have any questions? Again, let me check the chat.
There was one question about whether I've worked with any nonprofits in Colombia. That's a great question. So I'm currently working with Destiny Rescue, which is it's a organization that focuses solely on rescuing sex trafficking victims. And I've set them up with INTERPOL. We've had our first meeting, which was about 2 weeks ago. And ultimately, I believe they're going to set up an office in Colombia that will basically work with the police to go in and identify traffickers and ultimately provide that intelligence to the police to investigate. So I am working with them, but something that's actually unrelated to Colombia that came up recently was I had a meeting with an organization that works in North Cyprus. North Cyprus is in the Mediterranean Sea. And they explained that there's two parts of North Cyprus. There's a north and there's a south. They live in the north. The north is ran by the country of Turkey, and the south is not. It's a separate country that runs it. So there's the United Nations has a buffer zone between the north and the south, and it's basically passport controlled. And they said that in North Cyprus, human trafficking is rampant to the point that it exists in the form of nightclubs that operate as brothels, and that there's I think it was 40 to 50 nightclubs that operate as human trafficking brothels. And they'd come to me and ask, well, do you have any ideas of what they can do to assist with this? Because they're trying to develop out their anti-trafficking. And so I'd set them up with Destiny Rescue as well, who's going to be going in there to potentially do rescue operations to get these people off this island. And it's going to be interesting. I'll actually be going to Cyprus to witness it, probably in the fall. We'll see how the COVID vaccine works out. But that's the work that I've done with nonprofits.
Yeah, Jarrod, that was Dr. Holzer. She did her session this morning with nonprofits and how those entities can collaborate in order to minimize, human trafficking in the U.S. at least. Very, very, very. Y'all two actually should interact. Y'all two should send each other an email and get in contact with each other, because y'all could in some way collaborate again with her. She's created a website called Wiki Charities. And you may just review that and get an example where she's preloaded into this website all the nonprofits that help support the folks who are being victimized through human trafficking so they can get out of it, but no one ever knows where to go. So she's created this website that shows that. So y'all two really should talk. There could be some,
Yeah,
some
absolutely.
community there that may turn into something gigantic.
Great. I'm happy to send you my email. So I'll send you an email, Jarrod.
That'd be great. Just
Thank
check
you
it
for
out.
your,
Yeah,
Yep.
thank you.
Yeah, someone mentioned that Asia is the #1 for organ trafficking. So
That's interesting.
So another couple of points that I do want to, before we get off of here, that when you said in the beginning, the reason that human trafficking is so much more viable and attractive than drug trafficking is because with drugs, I got to keep rebuying the product in order to resell it.
Right.
But with humans, I have a sort of non-consumable product that can be excessively reused without ever having to rebuy the product. And that really hit home with me when you said that. That was quite a little traumatic to me to have it worded like that, but it made absolute sense. And of course, good luck on getting that Florida legislation passed. And thank you for being an activist and an advocate for this in your state, and hopefully that turns into some national. You and Angie both mentioned that TVPA, the Trafficking Victims, legislation. So Protection Act, I think it was called. And so again, there's stuff it looks like on a national level, and both in yours and in Angie's presentations, Jarrod, y'all both mentioned this key word, which is awareness. And I do believe if we all become more aware, and of course, training and education, money and resources are, useful, but unless we're aware, then we can't draw enough attention to it to get the training and the education and the resources. So y'all just continue to bang that drum. Y'all continue to draw attention to this and not ever let us forget about it.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a question about the southwest border and the children, the increased risk that they may experience. So I'm actually planning at some point, hopefully in the coming weeks, to actually go visit the southwest border just to see it. But I do think I think that the children are in far more danger on the Mexican side of the border, but they're definitely a substantial risk of being exploited. And I think that the traffickers are, they watch the news, they watch politics, and you can be assured in an area that already is completely ran by the traffickers. It's so bad in some of the southwest border towns on the Mexican side that that the traffickers set up. You don't have to worry about getting stopped in a police roadblock. You have to worry about getting stopped in a cartel roadblock where they search vehicles, where they kidnap people, where they will kidnap people and put them into sex trafficking. So as these issues are developing on the southwest border, there's no doubt going to be an increased risk of exploitation, especially for the unaccompanied minors before they get to the United States. So it is something that there's not a lot of, in my mind, there's not a lot of attention on it in terms of what the cartel members are doing, but those are really the ones to watch.
Jarrod, if you're going to go to the border and examine, make sure you get it done within the next month, because it's going to get pretty warm down there pretty fast.
Yes, it
We're
does.
already going to hit 90 this week in Phoenix. So
Right.
Anybody else have any other comments or questions for Jarrod? Well, if you do, you have his contact information there. And so, it's always difficult to take a whole bunch of information and knowledge and experience and jam it into a 1-hour presentation. So probably what happens, and the way my brain works, is when I finish these kinds of experiences, my brain continues to process that information, and maybe in the next day or two a question will pop up, and if so, just feel free to contact Dr. Sadulski there. So
Please reach out anytime.
that's right. So Jarrod, thank you again. We're glad that you made it back safely. I do have a friend whose wife is Colombian, and every time they go down to visit his in-laws, he says he has to get kidnapping insurance.
Wow.
And it is in case he's kidnapped, they will pay the ransom of whatever the kidnappers is. You just get insurance so your family doesn't have to have this financial burden and whatever. He's insured up to $1 million. So if they kidnap him and at least ask for $1 million, the insurance company will pay that. Isn't that interesting? An interesting type of insurance. Yeah. But anyway, that's sort of the world they live in whenever it's these kinds of lawless elements are sort of have their anchors, you know, in society. So anyway, take care, everybody. We hope to see you at the rest of the sessions this week of the colloquium. I'll send the recording around later. Okie doke. Bye-bye.